Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on recovery of the apparel sector in Sri Lanka following the COVID-19 pandemic. We are joined here today by an eminent panel, but before I introduce our panelists, this webinar is a part of a series of research that is being done by the Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka with regards to the economic impact of COVID-19, and in particular, this is in collaboration with a joint study that we are doing with CPD in Bangladesh to assess the impact of COVID-19 on the apparel sectors of Sri Lanka as well as Bangladesh with a grant by Southern Voice. So if you have any questions, please feel free to send in your questions through the Facebook live stream. We will be happy to integrate your questions during this discussion. So let me introduce our panel. We've got a very eminent panel representing different stakeholders, and hopefully we will have a lively and insightful discussion, not just about the impact of COVID-19 on the apparel sector, but rather also on possible solutions moving forward and what sort of policy as well as other changes and solutions can be done by different stakeholders over the next year or so. So joining us today is Mr. A. Sukumaran, the chairperson of the Joint Apparel Association of Sri Lanka, Mrs. Madhavie Gunawardena, the Commissioner of Labour for Women's and Children's Affairs at the Department of Labour in Sri Lanka, and Mr. Malith Jayasinghe, Director of Lesova Holdings in Sri Lanka. So thank you very much to our eminent panelists for their insight and for their time. So let me start off with Mr. Sukumaran with regards to kind of getting an insight into the sector. You are the chairman of the Joint Apparel Association Forum of JAAFSL. Also, you are part of, you head your own apparel company that is part of the export sector. Mr. Sukumaran, what has been the broad impacts, both in terms of your, as an exporter, but also in terms of the apparel sector overall from a manufacturer's perspective?
Thank you, Kithmina. Thank you for your question. Thank you for inviting me. Let me very briefly tell you where we are today and what happened, what led to that situation. This COVID pandemic, the situation we are in, started about a year ago, just January last year. And our industry was hit with 3 waves from this. So I'll break it down into 3 waves. The first wave was when in January, when it started last year, which was all about supply chain, where we couldn't get our materials from China. We thought we won't be able to fulfill our commitments. So that's how it started at the initial stages. So it took about 2 months. Then we thought the supply chain problem was getting sorted out. Then the second wave started hitting us. What's the second wave? So when the second wave started hitting us means where our customers, our markets started closing down. It moved from our supply chain, where raw material coming from the front end to our markets abroad. So that was not expected. So that had a major impact. But along with that, what happens is along with that, even we went into a lockdown. So when our markets are closed at that point, even Sri Lanka went into a lockdown. So both the supply chain partners, manufacturers, and our business and our buyers were all under lockdown. Then we came out of it. We came out of it somewhere around May, June, and we were on the correct path moving towards till about end of September, October. Then the third wave started hitting us. All of us know. When the third wave started hitting us, which gave us a lot of disruption. Why it created a lot of disruptions? Because our buyers started working, but we started working with limited, a lot of disruption in our working pattern. So that completely hit us because we were not in a playing field where our competing countries were working, our buyers are working, but we went into a disruption mode. So that is how the 3 waves started hitting us. What happens, what's the results of it? Results of it, if you take 2019, apparel industry had exports of around $5.3 billion. And we ended 2020 with about $1 billion, approximately 23% lower than the year earlier. But I had to confess, at the beginning stages, we anticipated it to be a bigger hit than what we ended up with. And if not for the third wave which hit us, we would have been in a much better situation. So we are starting now the new year, 1 year later, where our exports are 23% lower than what it was. So the question is, where do we go from now? This is where we stand. Kithmina?
Right. Mr. Sukumaran, just to follow up on that. So it's like you said, it's not just about what's happening in Sri Lanka, it's also about what's happening abroad, both in terms of our competitors as well as main markets. I'm guessing this is the UK and the European markets. So there is some concern about the second wave of cases that is coming up and the new strain that is coming up with new lockdowns in the UK, for example, and other parts of Europe. Has that had an impact on maybe potential and future expectations for the market, maybe over the next 3 months?
There is a slight effect, but not to the level where it was, because US is our main market, it still remain not affected by that particular wave. Still, it's continuing. Yes, UK has gone on the lockdown, but still the lockdown effect has really affected us to some extent, but not to the same level where the second wave hit us. So we are hoping with the vaccination coming and all this happening, the impact could be mitigated to a lower level.
Right. Mr. Jayasinghe, let me come to you. You are a director of a small and medium enterprise in the apparel sector. Mr. Sukumaran laid out kind of the broader picture that the exporters in particular are facing right now. What's the perspective from the small and medium perspective in terms of the impact of COVID?
Thank you, Kithmina, for having me here. And Mr. Sukumaran very correctly elaborated how the broader picture is like when it comes to the international export market. When it comes to the local market with the SME sector, the things are little different. Basically, the impact came little before the COVID event, because with the Easter attacks, we actually experienced seeing a downturn in the market, because the local sector, the entire market is basically based on seasonal demand. They missed the April season back in 2019. Then back in December 2019, they actually came up with they came to see the same issue. Once again, by mid 2020, they missed the next season, which was April 2020. So going forward, once again in 2020 December, a similar issue encountered. So what happened was people in the SME sector, they ran short of cash, no working capital. There was so much absenteeism in terms of the employees. Then again, there were mobility issues. Without having proper mobility, they found it extremely difficult to do their production operations. Once again, with transport operations having obstacles, they found it difficult to deliver the finished goods. On top of that, just like Mr. Sukumaran properly explained, most of the raw material, even for the local market, would come from other countries. So there was sort of a scarcity of material. Once again, with who were the suppliers who had material, they actually went into an increment in pricing. So the cost of production went up rapidly. There was a huge loss in the demand, and it came to a situation where the SME players found it extremely difficult to balance the cash flows, and it went into a whole downturn. Yes.
Mr. Jayasinghe, just to kind of follow up on that, there has been also, as I said earlier, this is part of a research study that we are doing at IPS on the apparel sector. And one of the comments that we've heard a lot is that the import restrictions, for example, have hurt the SME apparels manufacturers a lot more than, for example, the bigger exporters. Is this something that you have also faced in terms of the import restrictions on certain raw materials and things? Has that affected you?
Yes. Well, it goes in both ways. Say, for example, if it is a finished product, now the government is having plans to restrict the importing of finished garments. Even if that would be the case, probably in time to come, there would be a good time coming for the local manufacturing sector, so that they would have less competition coming from the international markets, where their cost of production would be probably at a lower rate. And when it comes to competing with such products with a higher cost of production here in Sri Lanka, the local SME players find it really difficult. And on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to raw materials, since there was only partial supplies coming from the local market when it comes to the garment industry. So the restrictions on such material coming from different countries would definitely affect the bottom line, and it would lead to lower margins and lower working capital possibilities for the SME sector.
Right. Mrs. Gunawardena, let me come to you. And I think Mr. Jayasinghe also kind of spoke about the issues that employees are facing in terms of mobility and also in terms of labor conditions. And there have been, health and safety guidelines that were introduced at the start of the pandemic, I think around March or April. Since then, of course, a lot has changed, but also a lot has not changed, particularly in terms of the second wave of cases. There was a focus on labor conditions in these factories. What sort of challenges have you observed over the past year when it comes to the pandemic and the labor conditions?
Thank you very much, Kithmina, especially for inviting me. If we look at our labor law, then it doesn't really separate garment sector or apparel sector, or we do have different ordinances. But what happened when the pandemic hit us was, initially all of us thought it was going to be only for about 3-4 days. Initially we had only 3 days of public leave, and then we were thinking, okay, this would go off, but it didn't, and then the country went into lockdown, and all these things happened in the shop floor without the influence or the intervention of both the employer or the employee. Now, our laws, we say, okay, if the employer is not allowing you to work, then your rights are violated. Again, we say, if the employee is not performing proper, then the employer is at a disadvantage. But when the pandemic hit, both these parties were not at fault. It was completely external, but then who was going to pay the salaries? What is going to happen? How are we going to bring them in? And then, so these are the challenges we had. And you might remember, we spoke with JAAFSL even. We had discussions, all these things. And then initially, at the very beginning itself, we have this ministerial level task force bringing in both the employers and the employees together, looking at the long-term employment protection. So that was a challenge, because if we look at the apparel sector itself, you have around 300,000 direct employees, and again around 600,000 indirect employees. So the first wave for us was these indirect employees, the indirect jobs, and then only it goes to the next. So it was a whole bag of challenges on our side as well. And just like the sector, even us, slowly facing it, finding the solutions at the moment.
Right. So what type of solutions have been proposed in response?
The first thing, now a situation like this is not really technically covered in the labor law. So then we had to go in for the employer-employee consensus agreements. So then the 14,500, we reached that agreement. Okay, if you are made to stay at home without work, then employer will be paying 14,500 or half your salary, whatever is higher. So that was one agreement. And then the I must say, most of our employers have been really good. They have been looking at the welfare of them. Now, we had situations of female employees being locked in their boarding places, and then we saw employers providing them with their meals, everything. Now these were not stipulated in our law. Even we do have provisions, but it doesn't say if you're staying home without being able to come to work, your employer has to provide. But then most of our employers have been doing that as well. And then, so in terms of salary and the payments, that is what we have been doing. And at the same time, we had our concerns on the female and pregnant and breastfeeding mothers. So then again, we cannot issue a directive or a law enactment here. So we issued guidelines in line with the health ministry guidelines. So those are the things we have been doing.
Mrs. Sukumaran, let me come to you on that. So there have been these guidelines that Mrs. Gunawardena, for example, just mentioned. And during the first phase or the first wave, we heard a lot about how investigations were happening and, you know, these factories were being monitored and so on. How did the industry, so how did the manufacturers or the factories adapt both in terms of creating these conditions and making sure that these guidelines were abided by, and also the obvious cost increase that comes with abiding by these guidelines? Mrs. Sukumaran, you need to unmute yourself, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. The guidelines came in stages. I think it was a learning curve for everybody. It's a new situation, so it was evolving. Initially, the guideline was very simple, where certain protocols was to be followed, like keeping distance, washing your hands, wearing masks, very simple protocols. And also which ended up in, we are not being able to bring 100% of our workforce to work. So that was an issue. That's how it started. So that stage, yes, there was a cost to the company in terms of we are not able to work the full scale, but we were able to go ahead. And that is where from June onwards till October, we were able to do much better in our export wise. Then the protocols changed. When I say the protocol changed from October onwards, when the second wave with Sri Lanka, the protocol changed to do PCR test, then the close contacts of the PCR test to be identified. That was a major hit to our industry. I'm not trying to question the protocol itself. I'm only trying to point out the impact to our industry. Now, if you take the numbers, is staggering. Now, the recent numbers which we have looked at, the BOI companies, private sector, has spent over the last 3 months over 1 billion rupees they have spent on PCR test, which we can't afford to do. So it is a major hit. And apart from that cost of that PCR itself, our major cost had been the continuity of operations. With this wave, with this detection, invariably the factories were unable to function at full capacity, which has put us in a very difficult situation. Because you have to understand, we are working on a fashion industry where we take our orders 4 months ago and we have to deliver to our customers. Come 4 months later, we are not being able to deliver our product for whatever the reason, we lose our credibility. And Sri Lanka built on a pillar as we are one of a very reliable supplier. And right now what's happening, that is under threat. So unless something different is done from now, we see more challenges in the year 2021. Kithmina?
Yeah, Mr. Jayasinghe, let me come to you. Now, there is, of course, the issue of costs that Mr. Sukumaran spoke about, and that obviously would be much higher for SMEs. And of course, the guidelines, even abiding by those guidelines must be even harder because factory sizes are smaller, etc. From an SME's perspective, but also from a kind of a broader perspective, how do you kind of see the current guidelines that are being implemented in terms of both implementation as well as going in the future? Can you sustain those guidelines if you are to kind of survive in the industry?
Yes, just like Ms. Madhavie and Mr. Sukumaran very correctly said, I mean, with the second wave, things have now become a little tougher for us as well, because the guidelines have been given in a way that we abide by those guidelines, and it's a mandatory process now. So when it comes to the process, what actually happened was, just like Ms. Madhavie said, we are now more focused on keeping our regular teammates, while slowly trying to reduce the number of indirect employees who have been working with us, because we have actually gone to the level that we have no further option, because of the current slowdown of demand. And on top of that, when additional precautionary measures have to be taken for operation, it becomes really tough on the SME sector as well.
Right. Mrs. Gunawardena, just following up on that now, there has been a lot of complaints by different stakeholders that we have interviewed, throughout the study and all that. The implementation of these guidelines, or the enforcement of these guidelines, I must say, by different authorities, changes from district to district, from city to city, from province to province, and from even some factory to factory. Who exactly is in charge of enforcing these guidelines? Is it the Department of Labour, or is it the Ministry of Health? Is it the PHIs who fall under the Ministry of Health? How does it work? What exactly is the process?
So, Kithmina, basically most of the laws and the guidelines that, especially the health guidelines that have been issued, are issued under the quarantine law. Now that is under the health ministry. The DG Health Services is the respective authority for that. So then, even into the factories, though we said that it is the labor law that prevails in the factories, for this particular pandemic period, for this particular pandemic related issues, it is the health guidelines that we have to obey. Now, even for example, if we take our office itself, we are usually bound by the establishment code and all these things. But come this pandemic situation, we have to make sure that we are maintaining our distances, PCR, everything. So all these things are by the quarantine law. So that is the issue. The Labour Department do come in, we do inspect. If there has been a complaint, we go and inspect with VSRs, terminations, all these things we look into. But at the same time, the enforcement of specific health, pandemic related health guidelines, that definitely is the health ministry.
Right. So I think that in itself is an issue, right? That there is a kind of a disconnect between the different authorities that are involved. And I guess there are gaps. Has there been any kind of coordination or kind of a move for coordination between maybe the Department of Health and, Department of Labour and the ministry to kind of coordinate or share resources when it comes to monitoring these guidelines, etc.?
Not really. So far, we have not had any coordination issues. My officers have been able to go and monitor. I work for a specialized division in the department. We have the understanding at the same time, on this 4th also we are having a program, and then we take the approval from the health ministry and do it. So there's this mutual respect. They also would not go in and say, okay, terminate these employees and that thing. And at the same time, we also will not go in and start implementing quarantine law.
Right. So let me kind of switch towards the more maybe medium-term solutions that can be done. I think before we start about kind of broader solutions, the most hot button topic right now is the vaccination strategy and the vaccinations that have been implemented in recent times. Mr. Sukumaran, let me come to you on this, because there's a lot of news that is being reported that the apparel sector has been kind of talking to the government about maybe a special vaccination program where the apparel sector might be able to fund some vaccinations to the sector or employees in the sector, etc. Would you have any information on that, and what's the process of potentially vaccinating employees in the apparel sector? Sorry, if you can unmute.
Yeah. Before coming to vaccination and our strategy, I will try to tell why we are trying to do that, because it's important we understand why we are trying to do that. Then only we'll understand the importance of it. Now, if you look at the global wave, the global situation right now, the demand for apparel has dropped by about 25–30%. Even before the pandemic, we were in a situation where we have excess supply of factories and lesser demand. Now, we are starting this year with demand going down by 30% on already oversupplied market, which means the situation is going to be way difficult for us. Then on top of that, what's happening is we are working on a fashion industry where we take work from our customers 3 months, 4 months ago, and we have to deliver in 4 months' time. But what is happening right now is we are taking our work, but coming 3 months down the line, due to various situations of closure, lockdowns, etc., we are unable to fulfill our requirements. But unfortunately, though we are in that unfortunate situation, some of our competitors are not having that situation. Some of our competitor countries who are even having a pandemic and a number of COVID cases much higher than us are able to fulfill our customers' requirements. How it is happening, why it is happening, I don't know, right? But that is the bottom line. Bottom line, you take some factories where the COVID cases are rampant. They are maybe 10 times, 100 times bigger than us, but they are fulfilling our customers' requirements. And our customers, one of the leading customers in Sri Lanka has come and told us, if we don't get our act together, they are going to pull out orders from this year onwards. And they also said, some of the countries, if I'm taking, say, Bangladesh, for example, they said their on-time delivery was for the last few months had been at 95%, but Sri Lanka is only at 65%. So we are losing our credibility with the customers and the work is going on. I would say that is to do with some of the health regulation we have in place. I am not trying to tell here whether the health regulations are correct or wrong, but these are the outcome of the health regulations, which the other countries are not facing. So taking that as a problem, we decided the only way we can get out of this problem is we vaccinate our employees. Because if we vaccinate our employees, obviously that problem will go away. So taking that as an example, we as an industry JAAFSL got together and made a proposal to the government. We are prepared to fund the vaccines for the whole apparel industry, 350,000 people, right? Which we as JAAFSL will make arrangement to collect the funds and government to ensure the vaccines are supplied. So that discussion is ongoing. And we are hoping, and there are positive signs. So we are hoping the government will give the final word so that we will be able to vaccinate the whole apparel industry workers come the month of May, April, May. That is our goal. But still we are waiting for the final word from the government.
Right. So if this were to go through, then would you be purchasing the vaccines from, let's say, AstraZeneca or Pfizer directly, or would it go through the government requesting from a supplier?
It will go through the government. Government is the only, my understanding is government is the only party who is allowed to import vaccines now. So we are asking government to buy the vaccines on our behalf, and we will fund it fully. We will fund it. And we even say we will fund it even if it's 350,000 people are there, we will fund even higher than to including some community, but get our priority because export sector is the priority. We are getting the situation. We are 47% of the country's total exports. The export doesn't function, and if our buyers start us pulling out, and if we start losing orders, right, the impact is tremendous for the companies as well as for the country. So it's in our interest as well as country's interest. It's important the export The people who are involved in the export industries are vaccinated as soon as possible. And we understand there could be a timing difference. That is why we are coming in and saying, we will fund it. Help us to get the vaccine because we can't get it direct from anywhere. Please help us to get the vaccine and do it as soon as possible.
Right. And my understanding is that the government so far only has the 20% of population covered through the WHO COVAX facility. And then, of course, the donations that are coming from India, etc. So, in fact, the apparel sector stepping in reduces the cost burden to the government as well in terms of vaccinating a proportion of the populace. Are SMEs, so Mr. Jayasinghe, are SMEs involved in this process as well? What's your involvement and how can SMEs get involved in this entire sector?
Yes. To my understanding, there is no such formal request that has come from the SMB sector as of now. But it would be ideal, just like Mr. Sukumaran said, it would be ideal if a similar mechanism could be implemented even in the SME sector, because the SME sector being a sector where it would contribute probably 52% of the GDP and probably having more than 45% of the workforce, definitely it would give us a boost to act as an industry, not as an industry, not act as a community for the revival of the economic activities in the country.
Mrs. Gunawardena, so speaking of kind of the Department of Labour, have you been involved? Is the Department of Labour involved in this kind of coordination and discussion happening between the apparel sector and the government to maybe vaccinate the apparel sector employees? And is there some sort of role that is being played?
As far as I know, I am not really aware of such discussions, but if that is happening, that must be happening at the very high levels, like the ministerial levels. So, but hearing this, it would be fantastic if we can do this.
And if we move forward, if, for example, the government approves this proposal by JAAFSL and the apparel industry, what role, or is there any role that the Department of Labour plays in facilitating this vaccination process? Are there any laws that maybe have to be taken into account?
At this moment, I don't think we will have any specific laws, but yes, definitely the factories ordinance and all those compliances will have to be met. But again, it will definitely be the national vaccination program in place for COVID-19 that will be in place. But definitely the Labour Department and even the ministry will be behind both parties to see this success, because last April, only 1% or 2%, actually 1.64% of our large industries were in full operation. We are doing the survey now to find out what has happened. We want to see this at 100%, and the situation was far worse for the SMEs. So yes, we will be behind both parties.
Just to follow up on that, Mrs. Gunawardena, do you know the kind of the total impact on employment maybe in the apparel sector over the past year? Is that, have you all done the surveys yet, or are you still waiting for data?
No, we did an initial survey in 2020 April May, and according to that we did have concerns because there were projected terminations, there were projected job losses, and also as I said, not a single sector was able to maintain their operations full time. Most of them could not even do it at least 50%. So at the moment we are doing the study, we are collecting our information, responses we are collecting. So afterwards, we will be able to definitely give a clearer picture on the employment status of the country.
Right. So one of the other solutions, and apparel sector employees in particular are kind of vulnerable to shocks. We saw this during the 2008 financial crisis. We again saw this a few years later when, GSP Plus was withdrawn from Sri Lanka. And we keep seeing the apparel sector employees being vulnerable to global shocks, even more so than kind of local shocks. Are there any policy decisions, Mrs. Gunawardena, being taken, for example, insurance schemes for people in the apparel sector that are being either in the pipeline or being kind of going to be introduced to ensure that we can mitigate the risks both to the employees, but also kind of reduce the risks to employers in the long run?
Actually, the requirement of a wider social security network has been in discussion, because especially if you look at the apparel sector, even the vulnerability is more because of this race to the bottom with the continuous attempts to reduce your labor cost. You see more and more outsourced workers in the factories. Now, those are the people who are going to be hit the first time. So those are the people that are not usually covered. So we are looking at imposing or bringing in wider social security coverage, and even the Cabinet of Ministers has actually directed us to bring in recommendations on that regard. So yes, definitely.
Mr. Sukumaran, do you think an insurance scheme geared towards the apparel sector employees is something that the industry will look at, maybe contributing towards, or maybe kind of facilitating at some point?
Now, the informal sector is a different thing. Informal sector is the one who don't have any of these safeguards. But when it comes to the formal sector, where many of the garment factories, clothing factories are under the formal sector. Under the formal sector, already it is not, we cannot just terminate employees. There are termination of employees has to be done with a certain guidelines under a law, under TEVA. There's a certain formula has to be applied. We have applied to the Labour Commissioner, and even if we apply, the approval is not given automatic. So already there is a mechanism, right? But we do, as an industry, we do propose a system to government to replace that TEVA system with the insurance scheme, where the industry will be willing to contribute to insurance scheme in replacement for the TEVA scheme. But that needs a broader discussion. So to answer your question, already the people who are in the formal employment, there is a process. There is some sort of a legal mechanism. And yes, we will be willing to consider contribution. We are revamping all necessary labor laws, but we will not be really supporting ad hoc changes. If you are looking at labor laws in ad hoc changes, some changes in different clauses, which we may not be in favor of. Yes, Kithmina.
Right. And what's the process? Who is expected to take kind of the first step in this regard to reform the sort of labor laws, and to see the reforms that everyone's kind of asking for? I mean, Mrs. Gunawardena agrees that labor laws possibly should be reformed and there needs to be some sort of changes. You and SMEs are all agreeing on this. What is the barrier towards these reforms?
You asked a very relevant question, which is very difficult to answer, but I will answer to best of my ability, right? Now, for some reason, nobody wants to put their hands into labor laws. I think that is politically influenced, because labor laws are related to a lot of votes, a lot of unions involved, a lot of other related issues. So everyone, even if it's a reasonable request, there's very little people who want to put their hands into really getting the labor laws changed. Even during the last regime, if I'm right, there was some proposal put forward by different stakeholders involved, including ILO, including the government, to redo or redefine the labor law, but it didn't see any light even to come out. So if you're asking me who is going to make responsible, my honest question is, I don't see anything happening in the near future, other than some ad hoc labor law changes coming, like what is happening over the last 2-3 months. You are seeing some ad hoc changes being put into the field, which we are not really in favor of. Other than that, I don't think anyone at the higher level would like to put their hands into changing labor laws, which is very unfortunate to a country like us. And that will be detrimental to the investment and the economic growth. We have to understand that. Thanks.
Right. Just to follow up on this kind of broader question, as well as kind of the more COVID-19 related issue, I guess this all works hand in hand, where you said, there is a demand by our biggest customer saying that if we don't get our act together, that they might move out of Sri Lanka, and that will obviously affect our industry as well. So I'm assuming that all these things are working at the same time, where our a lack of efficiency in terms of our labor laws also contributing to kind of the more ad hoc changes that are being introduced right now.
Kithmina, just to elaborate, the labor laws and the COVID pandemic situation now are two different things. Labor law situation had been there in a global way as an industry for a long time, right? Whether it aggravated the pandemic situation, no, I don't think there is a connection between there. I really don't see. So labor laws reforms has to be done regardless for the economic benefit of the country. It has to be done. Right now, the pandemic situation, what need to happen is the regulation, the health regulation which has put, right, which I believe should be relooked at it to be in competition with our rest of the world, right? So we believe that regulation changing could take some time. That is why we are trying to fast track is by allowing us to vaccinate all our employees at our cost. So we believe if that could be done, we are chipping in, right? So we vaccinate all our industry, 300 to 350,000 people. So this regulation doesn't matter. Then regulation doesn't matter means, yes, still we have to follow some regulations by social distancing, mask, all those you have to follow. But still you don't have to then follow the PCR testing, quarantine, all those, we believe all those will not come to the people who are already vaccinated. So our stance is that is the only way forward in the short run between now and next 3 months. If that doesn't happen, we could see rather serious repercussions.
Right. And by health regulations, I mean, I'm guessing you're talking about, for example, certain factories are shut down for 2-3 weeks because of a positive COVID test, even if you are willing to bring in outside workers for that time period and things like that, I'm guessing.
Generally, the regulation is like, if say you have to do 1% PCR test a day, right, which is 5% a week. So obviously, let's say one person got positive, then the close contacts has to be quarantined. So one person test positive, so close contacts could be 50. I don't know. Sometimes it's 70 because the person must be traveling in a bus. So sometimes one person maybe even end up with 100. Then in end of 7 days or 10 days, those 100 people has to be PCR tested. When you test the PCR test, what will the result? No one knows. If it comes in another 10 persons get PCR test at that time, you're looking at another 300, 400 people. Whereas we have already got orders to deliver next week. So we are in a very, very difficult situation. The orders came 4 months ago. So then we had to go to our customer and say, this is what the situation. We can't deliver your product. Then they are putting it back onto us. Look at this country, A, B, and C, who have much more COVID than you. But all my goods are coming on time. So something they are doing right. I don't know what they are doing right. I really don't know. Either they are doing something right or they are doing something wrong. I don't know, but they are delivering. That's the bottom line.
Right. Mr. Jayasinghe, I mean, just to kind of follow up on that, obviously you are facing the similar situation, but if this situation continues where kind of we have these ad hoc changes and so on, are you planning on making any drastic changes or any shifts in terms of how you operate over the next, let's say, 1 year at least?
Yes, as an SME, we are already trying to venture into other areas because we are seeing probably a dead end if this continues to happen for the next couple of months. Because specifically, I should tell during the past few months, you might have seen that 4% COVID working capital loan was granted to several SMEs. But if you would look at the whole picture, the big picture, there have been multiple SMEs who have not been able to have access to that 4% working capital loan just because of the fact that they do not have security to be kept against a bank against that particular loan, where most SMEs are basically sole proprietorship and partnership operations, where they would not have enough securities to be kept under the name of their particular entity. And if there could be a situation where the government can take part, they can mediate, and if they can have a mechanism where a guarantee system can be implemented, looking at the working capital structure or the cash flow situation of a particular organization, than solely looking at security per se, probably the SMEs would have few more months where they can try out new operations, where they can try out new products to see as to how they can stream through the difficult period up until such time that the entire, let's say, the entire country gets vaccinated at least.
Right. So just to follow up, I mean, so yes, the government is providing these 4% loan guarantee schemes, and I think the government is covering 2%, if I'm not mistaken, and banks are taking on the other 2% interest, that risk. But as you say, SMEs are struggling to access that because of more structural issues with getting those loans. And is that what you're kind of referring to?
Yes, that of course is another factor, because the process is a little cumbersome for most of the SMEs. That is one option. If we can simplify it a bit more, probably more and more SMEs would get benefited. On top of that, the 4% COVID loan would be granted for organizations who would have something as a collateral, so that the bank would have the assurance that the SMEs would pay it back. But vast majority of SMEs would not have immovable properties as collaterals to be kept for the bank to get the proper allocations for the 4% COVID loans. Of course, there are several organizations who have already received it, but if you look at the percentage, I'm pretty much sure a vast majority of deserving SMEs might not have received that COVID 4% working capital loan, and that of course have hindered them in doing their operations during the upcoming months. So when they struggle, they would find it difficult to plan out for the future even.
Right. Just to follow up, Mr. Jayasinghe, in terms of supply, now there is, of course, we kind of spoke earlier about import restrictions and things like that, but do you still have issues with regards to accessing raw materials and accessing that supply, or is that not now as big an issue right now?
Yes, now that the supplies are there, but the costs that you have to incur to gain those raw materials have gone up, and the cost of production has been a tremendous issue for the SME sector, whereas the market is not ready to pay the right price for the product. The cost of production would go up, and the market would probably demand for some discounts given the current scenario in the country. So there's a decrease of margins, once again going into the vicious cycle of finding it difficult to find enough working capital to roll out the operations for the SME sector.
What are the reasons for the cost of production or the cost of these raw materials going up?
Because the suppliers have decided that they would increase the prices in significant portions, and there's only a limited number of suppliers who are at the moment who are operating to bring down fabric specifically. Fabric would probably account for 60 to 65% of the overall cost of the garment. And when the cost of fabric goes up, however much we try to leverage that with other operations, still it would be difficult for the manufacturers or the service providers to keep the cost of product at a minimum level.
Mr. Sukumaran, in the recent budget that was passed, there was a proposal to establish a fabric park in the eastern province. Is this looking at addressing this issue of cost when it comes to or value addition within the industry?
Yeah, Kithmina, just to explain a little further. Now, we learned a lesson from this COVID pandemic situation. I said the first wave came because the problem we had in the first wave was we lost control of our supply chain. That is how it started. The majority of our goods are imported from China, and we found goods are not coming on time. And like Malith said, the prices of goods coming out of China is also going up. So with this situation, what we learned is it's vital that we control our own destiny to the extent which is possible. We can't do 100% to the extent which is possible. Right now, the apparel industry in Sri Lanka, value addition is around 52 to 53%, right? So we need to get it up to 60% where possible, which means less imports. So one of the things which we are focusing on that is to make sure we set up more fabric mills in Sri Lanka. So in that regard, we worked with the government, we gave our proposals which were accepted. That is how the budget proposal came in to set up a textile park in Hewage, which is a very good move. And we believe that like that, many more should come. So that is one of the long-term solutions for our problem. One is the supply chain. Other one is you also have to understand our markets are from US, Europe, don't want too much dependent on China. So they are looking at moving out their supply chain wherever possible out of China. So more we have the supply chain in our country or in this region, we will be winning more business. So that is why that proposal came, and I think that's a good move.
Right. So we have only a few more minutes left. So let me start with Mr. Sukumaran in terms of kind of following up on that is in terms of at least medium-term supply chain changes. So whether it's, as you said, the Eastern Province, Hewage Park is a long-term strategy. What are some of the medium-term strategies that the industry is taking right now to address supply chain issues?
The supply chain issue on the medium term is not a fully fledged solution, but we are looking at where moving some of our supply chain from where heavily dependent on certain province area to different countries, and also wherever things which we can quickly move into our country. There are fabric mills here, we are already here, if we can source more from them. And there are other supplies other than the fabrics, which can set up quicker what is needed for our industry. We are looking at setting up and expanding on that, right? We are working towards that and trying to bring our supply chain closer to our region and instead of concentrating in one area. Will that help us 100%? No, right? But that is a short-term solution, a medium-term solution, I should say. So that is what we are working on it at the moment.
Right. Mrs. Gunawardena, I mean, there is of course now a lag between right now potentially vaccinating the populace and also as Mr. Sukumaran and Mr. Jayasinghe have been talking about, there are issues when it comes to the regulations and guidelines that are involved as well. What are the medium-term and short-term measures that are being taken right now or in the pipeline to address some of these challenges that we are talking about?
First of all, I must say that even in the quarantine law, everything, Sri Lanka has been looking at problems in a very protectionist way. I'm not really sure whether that is the correct term, but even if you look at the labor law, we have provisions to protect the employee, protect the terms and conditions has to be there. Everything is very protectionist. You look at the quarantine and like, I was listening to what Mrs. Sukumaran was saying. Yes, so we have to make sure that the underlying thinking behind is, yes, we have to make sure that we are COVID free. So protective of our, like that is a separate discourse that we have to engage in. But then looking at what we have now, yes, there is a huge discussion going on the need of changing this law. As he correctly said, we have been continuing this discussion, and for some reason the employer, employee and the regulator do not come to the same level to implement. Even myself have been involved in one of these attempts. So that is there, and at the moment we are conducting this survey trying to paint the correct picture. We have to do it. We have to find out what is happening in the establishments to tell everyone, all trade unions, employers, the government, everyone, okay, this is what is happening, so we need to do this. So at the moment we are prioritizing on that.
Mrs. Gunawardena, there is also this kind of increased taboo against apparel sector workers, partly because the second wave of cases was linked to the apparel sector initially, and there was a lot of pressure, social pressure coming on apparel sector, unwanted social pressure coming towards apparel sector employees. Is there some role that the Department of Labour can play in kind of addressing these issues?
The social issues, like I went into quarantine twice, and like that social interaction changes. The moment you say that you are going into quarantine, everything changes. So I don't think we have any law to change our social perceptions and like our acceptance. But then if any of our employees, if anyone gets intimidated in their workplaces even, okay, because you became, if someone is complaining even, definitely they can come into the department, we will investigate. And at the same time, the other kind of harassment, the social harassment, the police is the only place where we can go to and address. But more than implementing law, it is mostly a social responsibility that we have to have, because no one looks at a health sector worker or a defense services personnel being infected with COVID. No one starts saying, okay, you were not following your protocols. But come this apparel incidents, yes, we saw that. So that is a social change we have to make.
Yeah, and I mean, particularly even politicians are getting infected right now, and they are not abiding by any regulations. So I think that's the world we live in. Mrs. Gunawardena, before I kind of wrap up and get to Mr. Jayasinghe, for any employees that are watching this webinar, and we'll hopefully have a singular translation later on as well. If they feel that certain health guidelines aren't being followed in their factories, what's the process of making those complaints and making sure that the factories abide by those regulations?
Yeah, no,
thank you very much. Sorry.
Mr. Sukumaran, I'll come to you as soon as Mr. Gunawardena finishes.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question, Kithmina. If an employee has any concerns, any complaints, they can definitely make a complaint. All our emails, all our telephone numbers, everything are available. Emails we look at, and it doesn't really have to have your name. You can make an anonymous complaint. Still, we will go and check. That happens. But at the same time, a kind request not to make this ability to complain to be used as a weapon against your employer. May it be your, the SME employer or the large scale employer. Don't make this a weapon to harass your employer, But if there's a genuine issue, please do complain. We are always there to look at it and take the steps.
Yeah. Mr. Sukumaran, you wanted to add something?
No, fine. She answered the question, so fine.
Okay, right. Mr. Jayasinghe, so I'll let you have the last word on this. As you rightly pointed out, SMEs play a large part in our economy as well as the apparel sector as well. What is it that you plan on doing over the next few months as well as maybe over the next year in terms of definitive changes, or what sort of changes would you like to see happening in the sector?
Yes, in the sector, we actually get to see some positive things taking place, because there has been a boom in the number of people who are actually coming into the SME sector. Now the term entrepreneurship has been widely recognized in the society here, even in Sri Lanka. So probably in time to come, people will understand that definitely the SME sector would be an option where they can get into and instead of going into the corporate sector for in search of a job, rather they can actually, the qualified individuals can go into the SME sector and do some real value addition to the wider society, so that the wider society would get benefited. In time to come, what I would like to see is the recognition getting better for the SME sector, and more awareness programs being organized for the SME sector for both the employers and the employees to understand different aspects of business, including it could be labor law, it could be, let's say, marketing, finance, it could be something with regard to using digital means for their search of new markets. Likewise, they are level, or it could be even on how to gain access to working capital. Whatever the knowledge that we can disseminate as a society, or the regulators, or as responsible entities from the corporate sector, it would definitely be beneficial for the SME sector.
Mr. Sukumaran, I'll let you have the last word overall in the panel. You spoke about the need to reassess the regulations that are in place, or the implementation of these regulations. You spoke about the need to kind of change certain policies, kind of revisit the issue of vaccinations. What other changes would you like to see that would help the apparel sector?
Now, Kithmina, I just be very brief. Now, we have to protect the industries. We have to protect the apparel exports. We have to protect the total exports of the country, every exporter, and we have to protect the economy of the country. And we have gone through several processes of changing the regulations, what need to be done. We have gone through that process. But if you ask me, what is the one thing which need to be done in the next 3 months to protect this? There's nothing but vaccination. That is the only thing, because we can go through these regulations, we can go through health regulations, but then we will keep on talking about it for months and months, right? So only one thing which need to happen within next 3 months is to vaccinate not only apparel sector employees, all the stakeholders involved in the export industry, because export industry is vital to the economy of this country. Please vaccinate them as a matter of priority. And we as industrialists will chip in to fund the cost of that vaccination, but get us the vaccine. That's the only thing which I will like to end this session with.
Right, and on that note, I think you make a valid point, and the important point there is you're not just asking the export sector to be prioritized blindly. You are paying for the cost of the vaccinations, and I think that's the important caveat there. And it will also not only help the export sector and the economy, but also reduce the financial burden on the government in terms of vaccinating and deploying a vaccination strategy for COVID-19. So on that note, Mr. Sukumaran, Mr. Jayasinghe, Mrs. Gunawardena, thank you very much for your insights. Hopefully our audience enjoys it, and you can continue. If anyone wants to join in later, you can watch it on Facebook, or it'll also be made available on YouTube in the future. The research study that IPS is working on jointly with CPD in Bangladesh through a grant by Southern Voice will be made public soon, within the next month or so. So we are hopeful that that report will reflect some of the insights that were shared here, as well as the insights that were shared by a broader field of stakeholders, from employees to kind of other suppliers and so on. So hopefully this contributes towards a positive change. Hopefully someone in government has watched this discussion and decides to implement some of the changes that everyone seems to agree on. And everyone seems to agree on the importance of those as well. So thank you very much all, and thank you very much for joining us. Take care of yourselves, and if possible, take care of someone else as well. Thank you.
Thank you.